I'm sure it comes as no surprise that I'm pretty obsessed with galaxies. One of the first videos I ever made for this channel was a watercolor galaxy tutorial, and since then I've made a whole bunch of other tutorials for galaxies using different mediums. But something I realized over the years of painting more and more galaxies is there are actually quite a few ways to go about painting them. So today I've broken down some of the various techniques to help you create galaxies in watercolor. Let's start with the materials that you'll need. First up is, of course, your choice watercolor paint. Your choice watercolor paper. I highly recommend that you use a paper that is meant for wet media, as it's going to make your painting process go a lot smoother. Some masking or painter's tape, Masonite or another type of hard board to be able to tape your paper down onto. You can always just tape it directly to your desk and forgo an extra board. A paintbrush or two. A toothbrush, preferably one that is either already designated as a paint toothbrush or a new one that will become designated as an art supply. Some white acrylic ink. If you don't have acrylic ink, you can always use more liquidy white acrylic paint, but really anything that is a nice opaque white that is going to be of a good consistency that you're going to be able to flick it will work. And optionally, a white gel pen. The first thing is to tape down your sheet of paper to prevent warping. You end up using quite a lot of water and paint for these kinds of galaxy or nebula paintings, and taping down your paper will help in minimizing the warping and buckling that can happen to the sheet. I'm also using the painter's tape to section off my page for the various galaxy paintings I'll be doing. We're going to start off pretty easy to get you used to some of the techniques that go into galaxy painting. You'll only require one paint color for this technique, and preferably something dark so that the stars will be quite visible when you add them later. Starting at the top of your sheet, begin by applying your paint color at its absolute strongest. You want to be using very little water in this section to keep your paint as opaque as possible. Add some more water to your brush and begin to pull some of that paint color from the top downwards to create a nice gradient. You want the bottom of the page to be noticeably lighter than the top, but you still want to keep that bottom section in more of a mid-tone range so that the stars will show up well on it. Go back in with more of your paint color and darken some areas up, and also use it to create texture just by adding some more blobs of paint onto areas. I guess you could describe this as creating cloud-like blobs. If you feel like it might be getting a little too dark, you can go in just with some straight water and start to pull up some of the color, and also use that extra water to create some interesting texture as well. Once you're happy with your texture and feel like you've finished this step, let that paint completely dry before moving on. You might decide when it is partially dry to also go back in and pick up some of that paint just with your paintbrush and some water to lighten up some more areas. Now, once your initial layer has completely dried, you might be very happy with how it's turned out, but I'm someone that finds that the best and most realistic looking galaxies come from added depth, so I'm going to be adding a second layer of paint. I basically just take this second layer to darken some areas up, maybe tweak a few things that might have dried a little strange. Watercolor is a fairly unpredictable medium, so sometimes some slight adjustments need to happen in subsequent layers. Once you're happy with your base, make sure your paint has thoroughly dried before going ahead and adding the stars. Get some of your white acrylic ink or whatever white acrylic paint you're using onto your toothbrush and begin to flick it onto the page. This is always the easiest and most satisfying part of any galaxy painting. And if you want, you can always go in with a white gel pen and add some specific stars, do any touch-ups, maybe you want some larger ones or create more constellation looking like areas. It's really all up to your personal preference. Now that we've played around with some of the more basic techniques involved in galaxy painting, let's get into something a little more involved. Begin by placing blobs of color randomly around your page. You want to create natural cloud-like shapes. Soften some of the edges of your blobs by using either just more water on your brush or even using other paint colors. You want these blobs to vary in color and opacity, but try not to have them take up the entire area of the paper. You want to leave some white space for the moment. Once you're finished with your blobs, start to add a darker contrasting paint color around those shapes. Think of those blobs more of like your nebula colored clouds, and this darker contrasting color that you're adding more of like the night sky behind those clouds. Now, I personally do not like to use straight black for any of my galaxy paintings. I find that it's a little too harsh, so for all of mine you will see me using dark blue colors, dark purpley gray colors, but this is just something that is completely personal preference. I start to go back and forth a bit with adding my darker, in this case, blue, and also more of my nebula cloud color just to help blend the transition a little more between the two. It's not bad if it's like more of a harsh, stark line there, but just having a little bit of a transition between the more vibrant, lighter clouds and the dark sky tends to look really nice. I also don't completely avoid putting any of my darker color on top of those lighter cloud shapes that we started with. I go back and forth a bit. I sort of try to sculpt out some interesting natural cloud-like shapes. A lot of it is back and forth at this stage, and there's really not a wrong way to do it. If you feel like you're at a bit of a loss with how the shapes and colors might interact with each other, you can always look up actual reference photos of galaxies and nebulas to help you along. This stage is really all about building up depth and adding color, going back and forth between your night sky color and adding more of those cloud colors in between there to create a nice transition, even maybe taking some of the paint away and creating more lighter sections if you feel like things are getting a little too dark. And again, once you feel like you've got that initial layer of paint down, let it completely dry before moving on. Once again, I'm going back in with a second layer of paint just to darken up some areas, add a bit more color to certain sections, maybe just blend in some areas a little better than they might have dried. The second layers never take me very long, and just taking that little bit of extra time to add a bit more of darkness and layering to the painting can really be what makes it look like you're looking into outer space. It's really the fairly extreme contrast that makes galaxies look realistic, and of course the darker colors are what the white painted stars will show up on more than the lighter areas. As usual, make sure your paint has thoroughly dried before you go and add any stars to your painting. You can actually really vary your star clusters even with the somewhat randomness of splattering a toothbrush. You can get closer to the page, you can even add some water onto the toothbrush beforehand if you want your stars to be a little more translucent or build them up more gradually. It's really all just about experimenting and finding out what your personal taste is for your own galaxy paintings. And of course, I'm going in with my white gel pen and just making some minor additions. I would consider this the more classical approach to galaxy painting, but let's move on to a more specific technique that ends in an incredible result. Start by creating a light streak of paint that flows across your page. On either side of that streak, start to gradually add a little more of an opaque color. Gradually work outwards from that initial stroke of paint, adding more opaque and dark paint colors. You want to try and blend these dark colors into the lighter ones to create a fairly smooth transition. Next, fill in the remainder of the page with an extremely dark paint color. Once again, trying to create a fairly smooth transition between the lighter streak and the remainder of the dark area of the page. You also want to keep this gradient stroke down the center and the darker area more of a natural shape. As you can see, I'm going back and forth again, just trying to sculpt out that shape a little more, try and keep it really natural looking. You definitely do not want it up and down. You want that sort of silhouette of the central light area to really go in and out and create somewhat of like a river flowing sense. Once again, once you're happy with that initial layer of paint, let it completely dry before moving on. Again, I'm going in with a second layer just to make a few minor adjustments to the overall shape of the light streak, as well as just getting rid of some of the patchiness that I wasn't too worried about on my first initial layer. I was really a lot more worried about the smooth transition between such light and dark colors. Once again, that second layer is really just all about refining and perfecting it to how you want your galaxy to look. Once again, let your paint completely dry before going ahead and adding your stars. Like I said, a super easy painting technique that gives off an incredible result. But I find that the most interesting galaxy paintings use a combination of all of these previous techniques. I'm going to start off with creating a base gradient color, but this time with the lightest color in the more central area of the page and working outwards to more darker colors from there. Once that paint layer has completely dried, I'm going to go ahead and start adding blobs of color randomly around the page, mostly avoiding that central section. I want to try and keep that fairly light. I'm adding in those cloud-like shapes using various colors as well as even some darker colors to really start to build up that depth. Again, it's really at that back and forth stage of gradually going back and forth between the slightly lighter colors and the darker colors and really using the wet paint to your advantage in trying to make a more gradual and smooth transition between the two. You don't want them to bleed into each other too much, but using that water to your advantage really helps in creating a nice looking galaxy. And of course, make sure you let that paint completely dry before moving on to your next layer. And once again, for my second layer, I'm really just adding more color, more darkness to create that depth, tweaking the shapes of the cloud-like areas, layering colors to create an interesting three-dimensional look, really just trying to create a nice interesting texture over the entire painting. Just something with a lot of interesting color variance and detail. And once again, make sure you let that layer of paint completely dry before moving on. Now, I actually decided to do a quick third layer just to refine a few details, add a bit more depth in certain areas. I always find that just stepping back from the painting after a little bit and taking the time to do another layer really is the way to go, and that's how you build up the depth. Try not to overwork the individual layers, and don't worry if any areas aren't looking out exactly like you maybe wanted them to. You can always add more paint over top. And once you're happy with that base layer of the galaxy and you've let everything completely dry, you can go ahead and add your stars. For this one, I made a quick initial layer of the splattered stars with the toothbrush, then went in with a gel pen just to add a few larger and brighter star areas, but then I also went back over top of that again with a little bit of paint on the toothbrush to create some more condensed star clusters. Once your paint has completely dried, you can go ahead and remove the tape from your page. And those are the finished galaxy paintings. I hope that these techniques have been helpful for getting you started with creating your own galaxy artwork, but thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.